So again, everyone, welcome. My name is Marisol Estrella. I coordinate a partnership between UN Environment and the Government of Norway's Oil for Development program, where we are supporting a number of countries around the world in strengthening local and national capacities to improve environmental management in their oil and gas sectors. So it is really our great pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon. We had a number of people who signed up and registered, and I see many of you with us today. This webinar on the fundamentals of oil and gas exploration and production is based on our 5-day foundation course, which we have developed and delivered in a number of countries. And it is therefore my great pleasure to introduce to you the 2 course experts who developed this foundation course and who is joining us for this webinar. Mr. Saad Ibrahim. You can wave, Saad. So Saad is based in Alberta, Canada, and our other course leader is Mr. Joppe Kramwinkel, who is based in Menorca, Spain. So welcome to the 2 of you. I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our team who made this webinar possible. Ms. Inga Peterson, who is in the background, and you're seeing chat messages from her. She is our extractives advisor and also supporting us in our program here on oil and gas and environment. And I also would like to introduce also a key member of our team, Ms. Chidela Zikoria, who is also a member of our team on oil and gas and environment here in Geneva. So before we start, I just wanted to go over some logistics so that we have a very smooth, we'll try to do a smooth webinar. Please post your questions at any time. We will take the questions at the end of the 2 presentations. You can post it in the chat box. So I think people have found the chat box already, and you can post it and we will keep track of your questions. The webinar is also being recorded. So I just wanted to alert everyone that it is live right now, but it is being recorded and you'll have the opportunity to listen again to this webinar. At the end of the webinar, you can receive a certificate of participation. You'll receive a link, but you must complete the webinar and the survey that will follow. And we'll be happy to send you a certificate of participating. There is a video that will be shown in the middle of this webinar, and what you will have to do is simply go down the icons toolbar where the chat, you've seen the chat icon. You just scroll down where there's videos. So when we start playing the video, you have to go to videos and unmute the audio. So I'll guide you through that again when we get to the video, okay? So without further ado, we can now start with our first presentation. Saad will start with his presentation on the technical considerations of oil and gas exploration production. And then this presentation will then be followed by Joppe, who will then focus on the environmental considerations at each stages of oil and gas exploration and production. So Saad, you can now unmute yourself and you can start. So go ahead.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on fundamentals of oil and gas. We're going to give you a quick overview of the industry, exploration, and production. We can't make you an expert in 20 minutes, but we'll give you a nice overview. So every day we use oil and gas in different shapes and forms, in our cars, in our kitchen, heating homes. All of these sources are called hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons are oil and gas. They are generated from organic material millions of years ago, and we use it on a daily basis. Just to give you an idea what is hydrocarbon, if you look at this diagram in front of you, it shows methane. That's natural gas. It's made of 1 atom, the carbon, the red one in the middle, attached to it 4 hydrogen atoms. That is natural gas, methane. So hydrocarbons have been generated from organic material many, many millions of years ago. Some organic materials like plants, animals were buried, and as more layers and layers of rocks accumulate on the top of it, in the absence of oxygen and maybe the presence of some bacterial content, these organic materials started to degenerate and form oil and gas. So basically a source rock, which is usually shale, is behind the generation of hydrocarbon, oil and gas. Are we running out of oil and gas reserves? Well, we've been using oil and gas for a century now or even more. And typically we've been producing what we call conventional oil and gas. So if you look at this pyramid shape here, the conventional is at the top, which easy to find, good quality oil and gas. Unfortunately, we are running out of the conventional, and basically we are looking now at a different source, which is the unconventional oil and gas. Unconventional means different kind of hydrocarbon, maybe heavier, difficult to find, not easy to produce, but there are plenty of it on Earth, and we believe that we have lots of it for future use. And some of these unconventional is shale gas, methane, tight sand, very challenging type of source of energy. But now we have new technology like drilling horizontal wells and multi-stage frac that we use to exploit the unconventional. Now, how about renewable energy? Oil and gas that we've been using for many, many years, whenever we use it, we burn oil or gas, which means we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is CO2. CO2 has a negative impact on the environment. Basically, it will cause the greenhouse effect. It will harm our ozone layer, which means it will allow more of the ultraviolet light to hit the earth, which is harmful to the environment. Also, it will increase the temperature of the earth, which is not favorable. Also, it's bad to inhale. CO2 is not good for the human health. So this is the outcome of using fossil fuel. So obviously we're looking for a renewable source of energy that is friendly to the environment, like solar energy, wind, hydropower. All of these are renewable source of energy that does not hurt the environment. However, these renewable source of energy will take quite a bit of time to develop, so we can use it easily in the future. But for now, we're still depending on the fossil fuel, oil and gas, which makes nearly 85% of all the energy that we use today. So we have to be patient until the renewable energy is becoming more available. Now, when we talk about the oil industry, it's a very diverse industry. It has three main phases that we're going to talk about. We start with the upstream. The upstream, which we're going to focus on in this webinar, it involves exploration and development and production operation. So in this phase, we have to do some work on the seismic exploration to find where we're going to drill our oil and gas wells, and how we're going to develop a field and how to produce it and maximize the production. That is the upstream oil and gas. The midstream is the second phase, where we need to transport what we produce from our wells, which is oil, gas, and water. And we have separation facilities to separate the gas from the oil and the water. And basically, we get these products for use. The oil and gas, obviously, we're going to need them. The water, we dispose of it. Now, let's move to the downstream. The downstream, which is the refining and the petrochemical segment of the industry. The crude that we produce cannot be used the way it is. We have to refine it. We have to extract product that we can use, like diesel and gasoline. And also the petrochemical, we use oil and gas to produce product like plastic, paint, even some medicine that we use from the oil and gas. So that is the downstream. Of course, we have also supporting industries. The oil business has major activities, so we require some supplies to come from supporting industry like steel, pipes, pumps, equipment, chemicals. All of these comes from supporting industry. So the upstream again is the portion where we explore for oil and gas, how to find oil and gas. And basically we start with what we call a seismic survey. We hire one of the seismic companies to come in, and you can see in the picture at the top, oops, no, let's go back again. You see, so those big trucks, they are vibrator. They have in the bottom of them a very heavy steel disc that will vibrate. It will send a shock wave or a seismic wave below the surface. It will bounce back, and these signals are received and interpreted basically with the purpose of defining where we're going to find traps, prospect where we can find oil and gas. The second part of it is the drilling. We have to drill wells, whether it's onshore or offshore, and we're going to show you a video on the drilling aspects. And the third part of this phase is production. So how we're going to produce oil and gas, whether it's onshore or offshore. Now, how can we find oil and gas, and what makes commercial production? Basically, 4 elements must be present. A source rock. So a source rock is where oil and gas are generated. Usually it's a shale where organic material are buried, and eventually it will degenerate into oil and gas. Oil and gas will migrate into a trap. So the curvature that you see here is what we call an anticline trap, where we have oil and gas trapped in it. At the top of the trap, there is a cap rock, which is the yellow color. This is like a seal. It will not allow oil and gas to dissipate and disappear. So now we have a commercial volume of oil and gas. Of course, we need to have also a good quality rock in this trap. Like it should be porous, it should be permeable, so we can produce oil and gas from it. Now, when we start exploration, if we have a very large piece of land to work with, like maybe 100,000 square kilometer, it is too expensive to run seismic survey, because seismic, it costs nearly $100,000 per one line, 1 kilometer. So we start with the fast tool. It's called air surveillance. We fly with an aeroplane that is equipped with very sensitive equipment. We run magnetic survey, gravity or stress survey. Basically, the purpose of this survey is to allow us to examine this large block of land and try to define the areas that are prospective. It could be only 5 or 10% of the total area. And once we have defined this prospective area, then we run seismic only across this part of the big block of land. Seismic is more accurate. It will help us to define the location of the well and the depth where we should be drilling the well. So that is the air surveillance. Now, seismic, as I mentioned, we usually hire one of the service companies to run seismic survey for us. And you can see that big truck, that yellow color. It's vibrating, it's sending a signal below the surface, and you can see we have layers and layers of different rock below. The signal will bounce back to the surface, and there are white dots. That's where we dig small holes, and we insert in these holes a hearing device called geophones to listen to the signal. All of this information will be processed by our geophysicist in the office, and basically give us a picture of what you see below the surface. And from this picture, we can locate the traps or the prospect where we intend to drill oil and gas wells. Now, we can also run seismic survey offshore, not just onshore. And you can see there is a boat, a seismic boat, and the boat has air guns. It has compressed air, so we send a blast of compressed air that will travel to the bottom of the sea, and below that, again, this blast of compressed air signal will reflect back to the surface, And the ship also is pulling another line. It's called the streamer, that has the geophones, the listening devices to listen to the reflection. And all of this data again will be interpreted, and our geophysicist will generate a map for us to show us what the subsurface geology looks like and where we're going to find traps. Now, when we talk about drilling wells, we have different kind of wells that we drill in the industry. We start with exploration wells. Exploration wells are the first wells that we drill in a new field to verify the data obtained from seismic that yes, there is a trap, there is a potential for oil and gas. So the first well is the risky well. Statistically, the chance of success in exploration is 1 out of 5. We might have to drill 5 wells just to have one discovery. So once we have a discovery, then we drill appraisal wells. Appraisal wells basically to define the edges of the field. So we drill 2 or 3 or 4 wells on the edges of the field. And once we define the size of the field, the edges, now we drill development wells, which are in the center of the field to produce oil and gas and exploit the reserve in a reasonable time. Of course, we also drill other wells like disposal wells. Whenever we produce oil and gas, we produce water with it because water was there first. And this water, unfortunately, is saline, so we have to dispose of it. So we drill disposal wells and we dump the water in saline aquifers so we don't hurt freshwater aquifers. So these are the type of wells that we drill. Basically, you see the diagram that shows the wellbore diagram. This is the Christmas tree at the top. We're going to talk about it in a minute. It has valves to control the production from the well or to shut in the well. And there's a steel pipe in the center. That's the tubing where oil and gas are produced through that. So that will take us to the end of this section. Now we're going to talk about a video. So Marisol will show you a video on drilling, how we drill a well.
Thank you. Sir. If you can mute yourself for now. Great. Now we're going to start the video. If all of you who are online can go to the icon.
The blowout preventer, or BOP, is
and unmute your audio. Okay, you have to go to the videos icon and unmute the audio in order to hear the audio. Okay, so we will now broadcast the video right now.
The blowout preventer, or BOP, is installed on top of the casing head before drilling commences. It contains high-pressure safety valves designed to seal the well hole and block the escape of underground gases or fluids in order to prevent a blowout from occurring. Drilling begins with a hole of a designated surface depth, usually about 50 to 100 feet below the water table. Special care is taken to prevent contamination of the groundwater by isolating the water table from the well with cement and steel casing. The bit is the cutting element used in rotary drilling. As the bit turns, it crushes the rock efficiently, then shoots fluid out to loosen and carry these rock chips up to the surface. New sections of pipe are added to the drilling string as the bit drills deeper. When the hole reaches a designated depth, the derrick hands circulate fluid through the hole to condition it for logging, the process of measuring and recording the characteristics of the well. The logging information lets the oil company determine if the well indeed can produce oil or gas. At this point, the company will decide whether the well is to be completed or plugged and abandoned. If the well is designated as a producer, the crew inserts the pipe back into the hole to ensure that the hole is still intact and circulates mud through it again to test the casing. If everything tests positively, they remove the drill pipe and rack it. At this point, the crew inserts the last string of production casing that runs the entire length of the hole and cements the casing in the hole. The production crew then brings in the workover unit and rigs it up to prepare the hole for production. The crew runs small diameter tubing into the hole as a conduit for oil or gas to flow up the well. Next, the workover unit trips out of the hole and picks up a perforating gun, which the crew lowers into the well to production depth using a thin metal cable called a wire line. An electrical signal is sent down the wire line, firing the gun and igniting explosive charges. These charges create holes through the cement, casing, and formation, connecting the wellbore to the reservoir. To stimulate the flow of hydrocarbons, sometimes it is necessary to frack the well. This involves pumping air, sand, and fluids under extreme pressure down the production tubing and out through the perforations. The process fractures or forces cracks into the formation. The remaining particles will hold the cracks open, releasing the oil or gas. Monitoring the flow enables the crew to determine the best location for the choke, the device that controls the flow of the oil or gas. Hydrocarbons were created from organically rich deposits subjected to tremendous heat and pressure. This same pressure has kept the hydrocarbons locked in the formation for millions of years. Once the pressure is released, the hydrocarbons are allowed to escape through the fractured zone and flow into the wellbore. The oil and gas can now travel up the casing string. The wellbore is isolated from the surrounding formations with casing and cement, preventing any contamination. The final step is to install a pump jack or production wellhead called a Christmas tree on the well. It is then time to produce the well and plan for any future field development.
Okay, so we have finished the video, and we will now continue with the second part of the presentation by Saad. So just hang on for a few seconds while we upload the second part. Saad, you should see your presentation.
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right, so now we've seen the video about drilling a well, which is a very important activity. The drilling rig is a major equipment. As you can see in this graph here, it has four main components. It has the rotary system, and you can see here there is an orange round equipment here. It's called the rotary table. It rotates the drill pipe. A drill pipe, you can see here we have a bunch of pipes, they called the drill pipes, about 3.5 inches in diameter and about 30 feet long or 10 meters. Basically, this pipe will be run in the well, and it has a drill bit in the bottom. A drill bit is a tool that has very sharp teeth. When it's rotating, it crushes the rock and basically make the hole. As we drill 30 feet, we add another pipe to it, so we keep adding joints until we reach the desired depth. Now you see also there's a mud system, and you can see there's a pit here is dug, lined with plastic, and the mud is basically it's clay mixed with water. We circulate the mud in the drill pipe basically to bring the cutting to the surface. If we can't bring the cutting to the surface, the drill pipe will get stuck in the hole. So we need obviously the mud system, very, very important. You see also a tower or a mast or a derrick. Basically from the top of the derrick we hang our hoisting system. The hoisting system will allow us to pull the pipe out of the hole. To maybe every now and then we have to replace the drill bit. So it has to be powerful enough to pull out of the hole maybe 7,000 feet long of steel pipe out of the hole. So these are the main components of the drilling rig. Some of the equipment that we use during drilling is the blowout preventer, and you've seen that in the video. It's a set of high pressure valves to allow us to control the well while drilling the well, because sometimes we drill through a zone of high pressure that could cause a kick or a blowout, which is very dangerous. You might have heard of many or several accidents where we have a blowout and the drilling rig goes on fire. So the blowout preventer or the BOP is only used during drilling operation. Once the well is drilled, we get rid of it and we replace it by the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree has sets of valves to allow us to control the well or shut it in if needed, or maybe run equipment down the well. So at the top there is a tree cap. If we wanted to run, say, a pressure gauge or tools down the well, we can open the top and run the equipment down the well. There is also a choke at the surface that will control the production rate from the well. So these are some of the equipment that you see at the surface while drilling and completing the well. Now we mentioned we have a mud system. The mud is a very important component of drilling a well. So we dig a mud pit lined with plastic, as you can see here, and we store the mud in it, which we're going to circulate in the drill pipe during the drilling operation. The purpose of this mud is basically to clean up the hole from the cuttings. As you create the hole, we crush the rocks. We have to bring the drill cutting to the surface to clean up the well bore and not to get stuck in the hole. Also, the mud will cool off the drill bit. This drill bit is grinding the rocks. It gets too hot. So if we don't cool it off, it can get damaged quicker. Also, the mud that we circulate in the well keeps the hole from caving or collapsing during the drilling operation. We have two types of mud, a water base and an oil base. A water base is the most common and the cheapest. It's made of clay mixed with water, basically. There are, though, some situations where we have to use an oil-based mud because there are some formations that are sensitive to fresh water. So instead of a water-based mud, we need to use an oil-based mud. Implication of the oil-based mud is that obviously when we drill the well and we have cutting coming to the surface, these cutting will be oil stained. So before we surface dispose it, we have to go through a cleaning process because obviously oil is not good for the environment. Selecting the mud depends on what is the cause and the technical performance and the impact on the environment. So the drilling engineer has to make that decision. All right, so basically we produce oil and gas. We need also to understand how important it is to test the well so we can tell what sort of facility size and design we should implement, whether it's tanks or flow lines or valves. All of these will be determined based on how much we can produce from a well. Also from testing the well, we can tell what sort of production forecast and revenue will come out of that well. For a new well, if there is no gas pipeline yet, while we're testing the well, we might have to flare the gas. Of course, there are rules and regulations on how much we can flare, so that depends on where you are. All right, so there are different techniques we use to enhance production from oil and gas wells. One of them is installing a pump, or we call it artificial lift. So if you look at this diagram, there is a pump. It has like a horse head, basically. That's one of the common pumps that we use to increase production. Also, we like to apply different techniques like water flooding techniques. So we can inject water in the well with the blue arrow, basically to replace what you produce. This will allow us to maintain the pressure, keep the energy high, and recover more oil, and it will help sweep the oil from the rock. So that technique, which is water flooding, is very, very common in our industry. In some situations, if we're dealing with heavy oil, very viscous like the molasses, that oil doesn't flow very nicely. So we have to loosen it up by injecting hot steam. So the steam will reduce the viscosity of the crude and allow us to produce large volume of heavy oil from these type of reservoirs. There are also situations where we inject other fluids that are more effective than water, like CO2 or chemicals, basically to recover even more oil out of our oil fields. There are situations where sometimes we'll get clogged or plugged or damaged, so we use well stimulation techniques like acidizing or fracking or using chemicals to allow us to recover more oil. Now, we produce oil and gas to the surface. We need to store it somehow. So onshore activities, we have what we call farm tanks. We can store oil or even produce water in it. You'll find these farm tanks are present in terminals like harbor or pipeline terminal, so we can transport the fluids. If you're offshore, we use large ships. It's called floating production, storage, and offloading. Those are massive ships. When you're producing offshore, we separate the water from the gas from the oil in the ship, and we have a shuttle boat to transport the oil. There's also underground storage in salt dome or cavern. Basically, this formation here down below the surface is made of salt. By circulating water in it, it will dissolve the salt And now we have a big space, a dome where we can store oil and gas. Of course, transportation is a very important part of the oil and gas business. We produce millions of barrels every day in gas. So we have different options. We can use pipeline, which is probably the most common and the safest. We can use rails. We can use trucks and even ships. Of course, by using trucks, we use more energy, so it requires more energy, and the same for rails. That's why pipelines are popular, and there is a massive network of pipeline in different parts of the world, North America or Europe or Africa. Now, we mentioned earlier that the crude that we produce is not usable unless we treat it. So we have refineries, we have petrochemical plants. In refineries, we extract useful product that we can use like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. All of these are products that are produced from refineries. Petrochemicals plants are also very important because there are products that we use every day made of oil and gas, such as plastic, solvent for paint, ointment, wax, polish, asphalt. All of these are products that we extract from the crude in the petrochemical plants. In addition to the liquid, we have the gas. We have natural gas that we produce. Anytime you produce oil, it does have gas in solution in it. So we have natural gas like methane and ethane, which we use for heating our homes or obviously for domestic use like cooking, whatever you need it at home. There's also liquid like propane, light liquid, propane and butane also is extracted from the crude. Decommissioning, every success story has an end. When you produce an oil field or gas field, you can't produce it forever. So there will come a time when the field is not commercial to produce. It's not profitable to produce, so we have to decommission the facility. The production life of a field depends on the size of the reserves and how much you're taking out of the reserves every day. That can obviously affect the production life. There are many activities that we like to implement to prolong the life of the field, so we continue to have cash flow, like introducing water flooding or any type of chemicals to prolong the life of the field. But there come a time when we reach the economic limit. Economic limit, this is when we're not making money. And the economic limit is dependent on the operating cost or the price of oil and gas and the remaining reserves. Decommissioning, meaning that we need to remove all the surface facilities. So in this picture, you see some facility like a pump and tanks. By decommissioning, if you look at the picture to the right, we bring the surface to the original condition as if there has not been any production whatsoever from this location. Also, decommissioning involved abandoning oil and gas wells. To abandon a well, we have to remove the Christmas tree, which is that set of valves at the surface, clean up the well, and we dump cement plugs in the wellbore across permeable zone, not to allow any flow from zones that are porous. So this diagram shows exactly a wellbore that is abandoned. You can see here that we are 1 meter from the ground level. We cut the casing down to 1 meter so it does not stick at the surface, and the brown color are cement plugs that we dump in the well in different spots where we believe that we have a porous zone so nothing can come out of it. Of course, the process of commissioning requires planning, even from the day that you drill the well. So we need to commit a certain fund when we drill a well that is put in a trust fund to allow us to abandon the well, because that costs money at the end of the production life. We don't want to drill a well and we don't have fund to abandon the well. That's what we call orphan well, a well that has no legal ownership and nobody's looking after it. So we need to avoid that situation by planning ahead, by putting to the side enough fund for decommissioning. Now, decommissioning or abandoning a well onshore is not that expensive. It could be maybe average $35,000 per well that is onshore. However, when we talk about decommissioning offshore facilities, we're talking about millions. It could be $30-40 million to decommission offshore platform. And also it takes a long time to plan for it. So we can't just decide to abandon or decommission a field in a month or two. It takes several years of planning to decommission the field. So that will take us to the end of my section.
Thank you very much, Brad. If you don't mind muting yourself now. As mentioned earlier, we will take the questions at the end. We will respond to questions at the end of the two presentations. So I see people are sending many questions, so I'm very happy about that. So now we will start the second presentation. Perhaps something that I wanted to clarify, this webinar is focusing on the upstream sector of oil and gas exploration and production. And that's why we asked Saad to focus mainly on exploration and production in the upstream sector. Some of you have asked questions about midstream and downstream sectors, which we will not address today. So the presentation that is following now, which will be presented by Joppe, will focus on the environmental considerations in the upstream sector. So focusing on the technical content, which Saad just presented right now. So please go ahead, Joppe. It's your turn to give your presentation.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. There seems to be an echo, but I hope everything is fine. Just wanted to say hi to everybody. I see you are from India, from Africa, from Canada, from everywhere. And I'm sitting here in the basement of Casa Larico in Minorca, and hopefully we're able to connect. What I'm trying to do here with you is following Saad's presentation, and I know you're not an expert yet on oil and gas exploration, but you at least know the main steps and how it works. And you already in your questions were asking about environmental considerations, and I would like to dwell a little bit deeper onto that. And I would like to start with that in 2015, because two major events, and some of you have already alluded to it, happened. One was the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, or the Sustainable Development Goals. I will come back to that, because that's extremely important that the international community, for the first time, put together a direction in which we all should go, and then all means both developed and developing countries. And the other one is basically the Paris Agreement, and some of you have already mentioned that for the first time, the international community, the governments together with all the NGOs and other stakeholders agreed that we should stay within the 2 degrees centigrade. How are we going to do that? That's not necessarily clear to me, but it basically says that we have to aim and do that. Now, both of them, the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement, are important for the oil and gas sector. And I would like to dwell a little bit on that. So this is the Paris Agreement, and here it says indeed that we have to stay below the 2 degrees centigrade. Some of you asked the question, okay, we should be all moving very quickly to renewables. Yes, that's true, but on the other hand, we're not going fast enough, we know that. So there will be, as Saad has said, a necessity to deliver still our energy needs by fossil fuels. We have to do that, however, with a concern about how to capture the CO2. So what I would like to focus a little bit more on is the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, because here for the first time, as I said earlier, we actually put together the agenda in how we want to move forward together. And I'd circled those which I think are most important for the oil and gas sector, but in reality, of course, all of them are important, and we have to work in harmony to make sure that that is going to happen. I'd like to start, this is going too quick. I'd like to start with something which I would say didn't surprise me, but it surprised me that it was so strong in the development goals, and that's the gender issue. And the oil and gas sector is extremely poor in achieving gender equality, in particular empowering women and girls. This statistic, 7.8%, we got from some study done in the Middle East, but in generally, it is not a strong point of the oil and gas sector, and we have to make sure that we are actually allowing the system to work in a way that women and in particular women are empowered to do that. And I have a nice story about that when we delivered that in Uganda. Some of you asked about water. Water is a very peculiar issue because, like every industry, like humans, the oil and gas sector needs water. Particularly, the Saad mentioned the drilling issue, and for drilling you need water to make the muds, and you need water to for humans. But the very funny thing about oil and gas sector is that it also produces water. It's sort of, you know, when you pump oil and gas up, and probably more with oil than with gas, you actually bring also water to the surface. Now you can do a few things with that, and I have here the slide, and focus a little bit on the left-hand side. So you bring the you produce the oil and or gas or whatever you're producing and bring it to the surface. You separate it. You bring the oil for export and the gas for export, but you're left with that water issue. Now, in some cases, you can actually re-inject the water underneath the oil or probably gas field, and you pressurize. You know, if you remember Saad's slide, at a certain moment he said water flooding. That's exactly what is happening here. You use the water to produce more oil and gas. You're not able to do that all the time. You're only actually able to do that in very peculiar cases. So what you're left with two options, basically to discharge the water to a saline or a non-potable aquifer. In other words, you discharge the water subsurface. You have to do that in a safe manner, of course. But on the other hand, it's very obvious that if you bring water to the surface and you are actually operating in a water scarce area, that water may be of use to somebody else. However, and I realized there's somebody from Oman on the call. So, I mean, this is a picture from Oman, and it looks very impressive but you see on the right-hand top, you see that the production water is being treated, and then it's being used to produce fiber crops. So there is a way to deal with that issue of cleaning up the water and produce something. But you can see two things here. One is that you know, the oil and gas sector doesn't want to use this water for crops which are consumed by humans, because that link is a little bit too far, so they produce fiber crops. And the second is you can only do that if the salt issue is manageable. In this particular case, because we're in the southern part of Oman, the production water salinity was about a third of seawater, so you can do that. So there are many ways to deal with the water issue, and I'm happy to answer any questions when we talk about water further. The sustainable growth, the issue of oil and gas is something rather peculiar for sustainable growth, because the investment in oil and gas is very big, and the returns are, of course, very big. And usually countries are aiming for getting foreign currency revenues for selling their crude. But at the same time, that amount of money can also be used in a very negative way, and is not used to invest into the future so that you actually diversify your economy. And the country I grew up in the Netherlands, we had a big gas field, and we exactly did that. We used the money to address things which went wrong in the past, and we didn't really invest in the future, and that's why it is called the Dutch disease. So oil and gas has this positive thing, potential positive thing in terms of economic development, but also is very you know, sort of sensitive to all the negative aspects, and that's why you read sometimes in the newspapers the black curse, the Dutch disease, because that all means that the money which is being earned with the oil and gas is not properly used. So what I then said was that, to me, infrastructure is very important, because the oil and gas sector depends very much on a good infrastructure in the country itself, because it generates peculiar wastes which are very, what I would say common in any country to be produced by industry or by humans. And it produces specific waste, in particular the oily waste. So I will talk a little bit later about the chemicals being used. What we see happening is that drilling produces cuttings and is using drilling fluids. And some questions, yes, drilling fluids will be reused to the maximum possible, but ultimately some of it will have to be disposed of. The tank washings have to be dealt with. Now, if those are oily tanks, then it means that you have oily waste, and we have to deal with the oily waste. Saad has mentioned something about that oil is a natural product, so you can use biological systems to deal with that, but you need to manage it. Then you have the non-hazardous solid waste, metals, wood, glass, construction waste, packing material, and it's all sort of material which is common for any country, and it has to be dealt with at a national level. And the oil and gas sector can help to set this up, but it is not necessarily the main driver for that. Hazardous waste, we talk about chemicals in a minute. Of course, you need for hazardous waste, you need specific facilities to deal with that. Normally, that would be dealt with incinerators. Waste from accidental discharges, we talk about that in a minute when we talk about contingency planning. And domestic waste is basically, there are humans and they generate waste, and that has to be dealt with. So the oil and gas sector can help to develop that infrastructure, but necessarily cannot be asked to do that as an obligation, because it is part and parcel of the wider waste management infrastructure development in the country. So why do I keep chemicals apart? Because chemicals are something rather peculiar, and chemicals are being used a lot in the oil and gas sector. And in the next slide, you see this, where it is being used. Now, if you looked at Saad's presentation, it's almost used in every step Saad mentioned. You use chemicals. Now, that's fine, and you need that from a production perspective, but it also generates a bit of a headache for those of us who have to deal with the consequences of the use of chemicals in terms of discharges. And so one of the consequences, one of the things which happened in the past a lot was that, when particularly offshore, you had this idea, if we throw it into the rivers or in the oceans and we dilute it, it's all fine. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right way of thinking, because here you see a slide about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Basically, it means that the concentration of the chemical being discharged in an aqueous environment is actually increasing, and ultimately, the osprey here, which is the top of the food chain, or the humans, if you can put a human on top of the food chain, are being affected by the chemicals which we discharge. So we have to manage these chemicals well. So we need to, and this is something which, sometimes inside a company, to me, it happened to me many times that I went into a chemical warehouse and I saw all these chemicals being there on shelves, not being used. And eventually they become waste, and then we have to deal with them, and we sometimes don't know how to deal with them. So that's why we need the help of regulators. And here you have a list of OSPAR, which is a convention on the use of convention on oil and gas development in oceans. And here you see that some chemicals are basically prohibited, and some chemicals should be substituted, so avoided to be used. We still use them. Is not available in the country. So climate change. We talked a lot about the issue of getting below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, there are two ways to deal with that. One is, of course, we have to transform and use more and more and more renewable energy. We know that that's not always possible, but okay, that's what we have to do. And at the same time, when we produce oil and gas, we have to reduce the CO2 or the greenhouse gases, which are associated with the development of that. Now, Saad mentioned that a little bit, but I would like to highlight two practices which we see a lot. And this is a picture from the Middle East, and I'm sorry for those in Qatar and Oman and Bahrain that I took a picture from your region, but a lot of flares are there. Basically, a flare is a system that allows, in case of safety, the gas to be removed. But what is happening a lot is that that those flares are being used to burn gas which is deemed to be uneconomical to collect. So in other words, we flare a lot more than we should. So we should be dealing with that. In some countries, we actually, the country says we are not allowing that to happen. It is happening, and we should actually reduce that absolutely to zero. Then there is this other, was the same gas, but it is not being flared. It's sort of vented. Basically, we don't see it. It's the leaks. It's the stuff which harms the environment even more, because the greenhouse potential of the gas is 20-25 times higher than the CO2. So we really have to deal with that. Unfortunately, woken up by probably the Paris Agreement, major oil companies are dealing with that and will reduce the leaks and the venting. But so the environmental concerns are clear. I'd like to highlight, and Saad mentioned something about that, and that's the local air quality. We cannot continue to burn all sorts of gases uncontrolled in the areas where there are also communities living. So local air quality in this context is new, but it is extremely important. So I wanted to show this slide because, we talk about these things as if, it happens everywhere, and everybody does the same thing. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. And here you see, and I'd like you to focus on the light pink, on my screen it's pink, it may be yellow on yours, which is the gas vented when you produce gas. And you can see basically in countries like Ukraine, that's the majority of the vented gas. And in a country like Denmark, that's completely controlled. So in other words, if you have a very strong regulatory environment, different things are happening. Oceans. To me, oceans are very important in the sense that we seem to forget that that's a natural infrastructure we have available to us. It produces food. It's being impacted by climate change. That's all true, but there's plastic issues associated with it, and I don't want to focus on that because that's not necessarily an issue of the oil and gas. What I wanted to focus on was actually the oil spills. And we do know that spills, and I know they can happen on onshore and offshore, but in offshore they usually are much more, sensitive, because they can spread very rapidly and they can cross very easily international boundaries. So I'd like to spend a few minutes on that. Of course, we don't want oil spills. Nobody wants oil spills. The oil and gas sector doesn't want spills, but it happens. And when it happens is that you can see these sort of environmental impacts. The way we deal with that is that we actually map our shores in a way that we understand the environmental sensitivity of the shores. And I just took an example of Zanzibar. You can see that all the coastline is mapped, and it is basically mapped according to sort of 5 ecological sensitivities. And basically what it means is that you actually put all your major effort in first instance to to protect the most ecological sensitive area. In this case, it is mostly mangroves. And basically, if you have to make a decision, what are you going to protect? Because that's another issue altogether. Then you would actually sacrifice the beach rather than make sure that and make sure that the oil is not reaching the most environmental sensitive area. Now, and I stop here. This is the last slide, so don't worry. And I see lots of things being triggered. I only wanted to make sure that of course, the government is responsible for ensuring that the system is in place, that they have their response structure in place, that their operations are there. However, there is an other important component which I'd like to share with you, which is the tiered response structure. And basically, it says that for all small spills, and you can argue what is a small spill, and of course, a spill in an area of a mangrove system is not a small spill because it is very, and somebody mentioned that already, it's a very high risk. But small spills are actually being or should be dealt with by those who spill, and in this case, the oil company. If the spills are bigger and the oil company cannot handle it with their own equipment, it has to work together with other oil companies or with the government in order to make sure that the risk is reduced to acceptable levels and that the equipment is being deployed and that the risk is managed in the way it should be. And ultimately, we have the large spills, and we just don't want large spills. I mean, tier 3 spills, that's when you actually get all the equipment in the world in your backyard, and you try to do as best as possible. And those of you who follow the news, you know that these are the big spills which are in the minds of most of us. And we don't talk about this, but of course we do. We talk about the BP Horizon spill, 2 or 3 months of oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, we're talking big business here. So I mean, BP nearly collapsed as a company because of that. And so we talk about a response structure, not necessarily about the reasons why these spills are there. But rest assured that the tier 3 spill, that's when everybody comes together and everybody puts all equipment which they have available, and all the brain power comes together to deal with that. And so these 3 tiers are very important underlying principles which most countries have adopted in terms of response structure. So biodiversity, I just wanted to highlight this because we talked and talked about there's enough oil and gas and we're going to places, however, where we are going to look for oil and gas, where the areas are known to us in terms of biodiversity, and we really have to start to look at the impacts the oil and gas sector has on that. Should we allow the oil and gas to be explored in those areas or not? So biodiversity is a very important component, decision component, and it basically means that the oil and gas sector and governments, and I'll come back to that in a second, are fully aware that you are possibly sacrificing something which is very unique for something which may not necessarily be the way forward. So that's biodiversity. Now here, some of you may have picked it up, but this SDG number 17, revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development, working together. Yes, if somebody asked, should you do environmental impact assessment? Yes, you should do that from the beginning. And if you look at the process of environmental impact assessment, stakeholder consultation is an important component of it. So yes, the whole issue of partnership is important. But ultimately, there's only one institution which is responsible to regulate the oil and gas sector, and that's the government. So I'd like to, so when we end up, and we say this a lot, is that good environmental governance is very important. In other words, to have a robust legal framework, including principles for implementation, and we talk about environmental impact assessments here, is important. Transparency and stakeholder participation should be clearly stated into the robust legal framework. Compliance, auditing, and monitoring, we don't talk a lot about that, but it is important that the oil and gas sector feels that the government is looking at them, and they looking means auditing and monitoring. And if they don't comply, just sanction them, and really having a lot of people available to you to do that. Ultimately, what is the legal structure? When we talk about this, we you know, depending on the country where you are, you either have a constitution, and sometimes it is in the constitution, sometimes it's not. Sometimes the laws and the acts are important, and the laws and acts drive the regulations, and ultimately you have the individual permits and decisions. Normally the oil and gas sector says, you know, regulate everything in proper laws and regulations, because then you have a level playing field, and also for stakeholders, it's important that there is clarity in laws and regulations and individual permits. God knows what can happen in individual permits. Now, this triangle is influenced and is informed with what's happening in the global world. So, I mean, this is what is the national government. And you have a lot of international conventions which countries subscribe to, and that has to be translated in legal structures in the country. So, you know, Marisol asked me, you know, and I said, well, look, I have 6 pages of climate, of environmental conventions, agreements, etc., which could be relevant for oil and gas. So, I mean, this is not something we can do in 20 minutes. So I'm happy to share that later. But there is another component which is very interesting, and we talked about this. And that is that there is international guidance available as to how oil and gas should operate locally, and that's the International Finance Corporation.
So I just wanted to thank Jope for the presentation. I think it provided a very good overview of all the environmental considerations that one must take into account, just even for the upstream sector, even from the starting point of exploration to drilling and production. So I think we've reached a point in our webinar where we can start to address some of the questions. Can I just ask, I think Saad, your microphone is still turned on. I will just ask the presenters to mute themselves, and I will moderate some of the questions. We can't, of course, take all of your questions now. Like you've asked many good questions. We'll just try to pick a few that will give you a sense of responses from our experts. And our experts will come on, will unmute themselves when this question is directed to them, okay? So maybe I'll start with Saad and Saad's presentation. There was a question, Saad, about, you know, how long really will fossil fuels last? And is it really realistic to expect that fossil fuels would dominate the global energy mix for the next 30 to 40 years? Go ahead.
Okay, fossil energy is very extensive. We have very large reserves, especially for the unconventional that we mentioned earlier, that could last over 100 years easily. So we have a long life for the fossil fuel. The renewable source of energy, it's still slow in development to make it affordable, available in different parts of the world. So unfortunately, we have to live with the fossil fuel for at least a century, if not more.
And I think, Saad, we could also add that 52% of our energy needs right now depend on fossil fuels. So that's why it's still expected, at least for the couple of decades, that it will be important. Perhaps another question that you might want to take up. What are the different factors that convince companies that there's a business case to start drilling?
What are the factors? Is that the question?
What are the factors that make a business case for oil companies to start drilling?
All right. When we talk about international operation, usually oil companies, they like to sign a production sharing agreement with the local government to start exploring for oil and gas. Some countries, they offer very high incentives that will allow the oil company to make more profit. And some countries, they are very tight and they don't give enough incentive for the oil companies to sign production sharing agreement. So that depends on how motivated the government is to offer attractive production sharing agreement to attract investment and companies to operate in their countries.
I had a few sort of technical questions from your presentation, sir, that were probably straightforward to answer for you. The first one is, when you case, when you start casing the drill well, what types of materials are used?
Okay, the casing itself, it's a carbon steel. It's a normal steel that we run in the well. And then the cement, it's a cement slurry that we circulate behind the casing to fill the gap between the hole itself and the casing. So the cement has to fill up that space. We also produce through a steel pipe, we call it the tubing, that is run inside the casing. So these are the main components really of completing the well. And we mentioned earlier at the top we have the Christmas tree, which is a set of valves to control production from the well, or if we wanted to shut in the well. So that's pretty well all the material we need to complete the well with.
I have another technical question, but Thad, can you mute your microphone while I read out the question? Thank you. So another technical question is, the drilling muds that are used. You elaborated on different types of drilling fluids, water-based, oil-based. Is it reusable?
Yes, it is. We usually clean up the mud, though, when it comes back to the surface. When we circulate the mud, we have to get rid of any gas in it. Sometimes the mud will pick some gas or hydrocarbon while we're circulating the well. Also, we have to get rid of some of the small fines like silt, because silt in the mud can damage the pumps when we're pumping the mud. So the mud goes through a cleaning process, but obviously it can be used again and again.
Thank you, Thad. And finally, maybe if you can just reflect, there were an early question about unconventional oil and gas reserves. And what is your reflection these days in terms of its economic production versus, investing further in renewable energy? I mean, which is more economic these days, to continue looking at unconventional oil and gas reserves, or looking into renewable sources of energy?
Okay, unconventional oil and gas is much more expensive than conventional oil and gas. However, with the crash of the price of oil, the oil companies became so efficient that they can make money from unconventional, like oil shale or shale gas. Even at $40 a barrel, we can make money. So the unconventional is becoming definitely very commercial. And it is available. The advantage of oil and gas, whether it's conventional or unconventional, it's very portable. I can have oil in my car, in the airplanes, but the unconventional, like wind or solar energy, it's not portable. So it will take a long time to make it accessible to lots of people. That's why we say fossil fuel, oil and gas, will be with us for a long time in the future.
Okay, thank you, Saad. I will now turn to Jope, because there are a number of questions that also came in. Jope, I just wanted, because you presented a number of environmental issues, and there was a question about, in your opinion, what is the most pressing environmental concern issue that needs to be dealt with in the upstream sector when we do oil exploration production? Joppe, are you there?
Yes, I'm there again. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Let me put on my webinar. Depends where you are. Of course, I wouldn't be what I am if I don't think that the water issue is the most important one. Because in the countries I worked in Oman, if you are actually in an water scarce area, access to water and be able to clean up your production water and discharge it is a very big issue. So I would say that's one of them. The other issue, and it's reflecting a little bit on the questions which are there, is this whole flaring and venting issue. I mean, in the past we just didn't look at that. It was very difficult to get the oil and gas sector to deal with that. That has changed because of the Paris Agreement and because of the SDGs. It has changed. So there is no international regulation which says thou shalt not flare, thou shalt not vent. But there is a lot of international pressure to say minimize it, economize it, make sure that you collect the gas, that you actually commercialize it. And you can see where, you know, Saad remembers that we were in Uganda and they basically say at a national level, you know, thou shalt not flare. Now, that's a big issue for me because we don't necessarily have all the solutions there. So I would say water and the flaring venting issue are the two biggest ones.
Thank you, Joppe. There was also a question about naturally occurring radioactive materials that come as a result of exploration and production. What is the potential of real contamination, and how does one avoid it?
Yeah, I saw that, and I saw that's coming. And the reason why I didn't mention it is that the natural occurring radiation is something which is not happening all the time. It's happening only in peculiar operations. And what it actually means is that very small particles, which have a radioactive potential, collect, and they are actually inside pipes and they form scale. And so, like with bioaccumulation, you see that the radiation is increasing. So if you are going to replace these pipes with others, you suddenly have a radioactive source, which can be harmful. I say can be, because not always, can be harmful for humans. So if it stays into the water phase, it's fine, it's very small, it disappears. But if it collects on the pipes in scale, and I've only seen that happening in a few fields in Oman, and I've seen it happening in Syria. I haven't seen it happening, Saad can probably confirm that, in many other places. So yes, it is a potential. Yes, you have to look for it, you have to monitor it, but it is not something which is happening in all operations everywhere in the world.
Thank you, Saad. There was also a question about, when do environmental impact assessments need to be conducted? I mean, does it need to be conducted at which stage of the exploration production process?
Well, I would say as early as possible. So that would be in the seismic exploration phase, when you are actually showing your face for the first time in an area. So most regulations I've seen require an environmental impact assessment or an environmental impact statement, which is slightly lesser form for seismic operations, certainly offshore and certainly on land, because you actually are dealing with, if you followed Saad very carefully, he said seismic operation doesn't necessarily mean that you are actually finding the oil and gas. Seismic only gives you more information, but you bring physically equipment and people to a place. So you need to do your environmental impact assessment. And, hopefully, because that's why you spend the money, you find oil and gas and then you build on that for the next phase, and if you success reduction drilling. So I would say environmental impact assessment already in the seismic operations is essential.
So Jope, perhaps you could also sort of then touch on like other tools besides EIAs where, you know, one can also take, because there are many stages of this process and many environmental impacts that need to be taken into account. You know, how does one address, you know, cumulative impacts and as well as some of these secondary or indirect impacts that result from these operations? What tools exist for regulators and for countries?
Now she's catching me here. I would say that cumulative impacts is an essential component of the environmental impact assessment. So in other words, you have to look around and see, you know, if you're doing a seismic operation in one particular area, or if you then go and you find your oil and gas, what does it mean if they find oil and gas in the neighborhood? And sometimes you can see that in the impact assessment is that the best possible option is to work together and develop that together. So I'm not necessarily saying here tools. I'm only saying here that because the tool is the environmental impact assessment, but I'm saying that one should address cumulative impacts in your environmental impact assessment.
Thanks very much, Jope. Perhaps another question is about risk assessments. At what point do risk assessments, should risk assessments and contingency planning take place?
Well, I just, before I link it to oil spill response, it's risk assessment is a key component of the environmental impact assessment. So in other words, to address the risk is key to it. So when you look at it, oil spill response, it's the first time you actually have a potential to have a spill or have it is when you do exploration drilling. So in other words, I would argue that when you do exploration, you need to have a response plan in place and your government with the government to work with that. So the risk will be determined by the way the company is managing its exploration drilling, and then of course the whole plan to be drilling your operation. So timing, it's again exploration drilling. It's the first time when you very well, we talked about that. When we are living in a country, had a lot of passing tankers and another risk associated with it. So, yeah, from this particular course perspective, I would argue exploration drilling. From a national perspective, there are many other risks associated with it. So, before you can do your planning, you have to know your risk, and that can be passing tankers. That can be, well, somebody said they had trucks moving in Kenya from the oil field to the, that's a risk. So we have to deal with that. And you have to have a response in place to deal with that. So don't know whether that is the answer you wanted, but I think the assessment is so essential to look at what you have and how it is moving. And from a perspective of the life cycle of the oil and gas, it's the exploration drilling, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there are no other risks associated with oil in the country which you have to deal with.
Thank you, Jope. I think, you know, we are now approaching 5:30 here in Geneva, so we're now reaching our 90-minute sort of limit for our webinar. So I just wanted to close the question and answer. I know there were many questions that came in, and I hope, you know, we managed to touch on some of those key questions. Of course, this is just the first of a series of webinars that we hope to do. As I mentioned, you know, the work that UN Environment is doing in a number of countries in partnership with Norway's Oil for Development program is developing and delivering a number of these trainings. One of them is the foundation course, which I mentioned earlier, of which this webinar was based. But we have a number of other trainings that we have developed, which focus on very specific issues like chemicals and waste management, the air emissions. We have a training on air emissions. We also have a training on emergency preparedness and response. So what we hope to do is also then share some of these training content. So since many people seem to be very interested in some of these topic areas. So I just wanted to then make a few final remarks before we close the webinar. So we will actually send a survey at the end of this webinar for you to complete. We would really welcome your feedback on the survey. And it is also a way to receive your certificate of participation. So if you can it should take you not more than 5 minutes. It asks a few questions and your feedback on the survey. And then if you complete the survey, we can then send you a certificate of participation for the webinar. Many of you have been asking, for more materials to be shared. And this is, as I said, just the beginning of the work that we hope to be disseminating to all of you and all those other people interested. So shortly after the conclusion of this webinar, give us a day to edit the video of this webinar, and we will then share with you the full video of the webinar together with the transcript. Okay, so it will help you also follow throughout the webinar. And in that video, we'll have the slides embedded and also the video that was played earlier. We can also share you the link to the video, which is available on YouTube anyway. So you will receive this notification shortly after the webinar to complete the survey. And then in a day or two, you will receive another notification sharing with you the edited video. What I would also like to do is invite you to join our global network on environment and oil and gas, which we recently established. We are on LinkedIn, so we will also share you the LinkedIn invitation to join this group. And this is how we can then reach you and share some of these materials that you're looking for on looking at environmental management and oil and gas. We will do our best to be consolidating this information. We hope to launch our first quarterly newsletter. So we really invite you to join our LinkedIn group so you stay tuned to what we are doing and some of the activities that we have planned and materials that we can share with you. So we're definitely looking forward to seeing you in the LinkedIn group. So with that, I would like to again thank our two course leaders who made their time available and really delivered such a great presentation. I hope you also found it beneficial. I would like to thank the team who has been helping us, Chidima and Inga in the background, who have been responding to you, and Renee, who is also as part of our team here. So may I just congratulate everybody for a really excellent webinar. I also learned a lot. And so I would like to now conclude and thank you all for joining us. So best wishes from Geneva. Bye-bye.